Welcome back to The Deep Dive, where we take a stack of sources, articles, research, and expert notes, distill them down to the most potent, fascinating insights, and deliver them directly to you.
And today, we are really jumping into the deep end.
We're tackling the early Roman Empire, specifically through the eyes of a man who is, well, universally regarded as its most crucial chronicler, Publius Cornelius Tacitus.
He's such a pivotal figure. I mean, Tacitus didn't just record the history of Rome's huge shift from, the illusion of a republic to the reality of full-blown autocracy.
No, he did more than that.
He was the first great diagnostician of the moral and psychological sickness that tyranny just inflicts on a governing class.
Okay, let's unpack that. We've got a set of sources here that focus on Tacitus's life, which was tumultuous to say the least.
Right.
And his 5 surviving works, the monumental Annals and Histories, and his style, which is famously dense, but just absolutely mesmerizing.
It really is.
So our mission today is to go beyond just the summary of facts. We want to get at the key political and philosophical lessons Tacitus left for us about the corrosive nature of unchecked power.
And the steep price paid by the Roman elite for their silence and, a lot of the time, their outright complicity. He was a survivor, and you can feel it in his writing.
Absolutely.
And, we have to start with this fantastic irony, right, in his name. Publius Cornelius Tacitus. That last name, his cognomen, Tacitus. It literally means silent.
The man named Silent became the defining voice of Roman imperial corruption.
Exactly. It's a contradiction that's just built into his identity from the start.
He wasn't quiet at all in his actual life, was he?
Not in the slightest. The sources confirm he was anything but. He rose to immense fame as a renowned orator, a public speaker in the Roman courts.
His friend, Pliny the Younger, wrote about him.
He did. His close friend, Pliny, often wrote about him and remarked on the sheer majesty of Tacitus's courtroom presence, the gravity of his speech. I mean, the man who was silent by name was actually one of the most powerful voices of his generation.
A voice that, 2 millennia later, basically defines the moral landscape of the empire for us.
It really does.
And the scope of his historical ambition, it just matches that towering reputation. He set out to craft a single, continuous narrative spanning nearly a century of Roman rule.
A truly staggering project. I mean, think about it. It was initially planned for 30 books, split between the Annals and the Histories.
30 books?
His goal was to cover 82 years, starting from the death of the first emperor, Augustus, in 14 AD, all the way up to the end of the deeply traumatic reign of Domitian in 96 AD.
So he was trying to establish a kind of historical continuity for this era?
That's it. This pivotal era that really solidified the transition from the Republican past into, well, the authoritarian present.
So he wasn't just, listing events. He was deliberately creating a unified narrative thread showing how one system died and another was born.
And the moral compromises required along the way. That's the key. He wanted you, the reader, to see the inexorable progression of imperial power.
How the subtle manipulations of one emperor became the outright madness of the next.
Exactly. How the subtle manipulations of Tiberius became the madness of Caligula and Nero, and how that culminated in the sheer terror of Domitian. It was a project rooted in the psychology of decline.
Okay, let's turn to the man himself. The sources place his birth around AD 56 or 57, and he wasn't born into one of the old, storied patrician families.
No, he was from the slightly lower but very ambitious equestrian class. And there was even some confusion over his praenomen, his first name. Some manuscripts say Gaius.
But Publius is the one that sticks.
Right. Publius is the name that dominates the surviving material we have.
And his social status, that's the first key insight into his perspective, right?
It's huge. The old Roman aristocracy, the one that had defined the Republic, it was largely decimated by the civil wars and proscriptions of the late Republic and early Empire.
So a new class was rising.
A new class was rising. Tacitus belonged to the, let's call it the nouveau riche of the equestrian class. And this is so significant because he owed his entire career explicitly to the emperors.
Specifically, the Flavian dynasty.
Yes, Vespasian and Titus, who ruled from 69 to 79 AD, he even acknowledges this debt himself. It shows that political advancement was now strictly a patronage system. It was all about who you knew, who favored you.
Not about your family name anymore.
Exactly. It was entirely dependent on imperial favor, rather than some ancient ancestral claim.
And that dependency must have created Well, an inherently complicated position for a man who would later become history's fiercest critic of tyranny.
Oh, absolutely. He couldn't claim purity. He was part of the very system he criticized.
So when he's criticizing the Senate for, squandering its liberty, he's kind of talking about himself.
Precisely. He's talking about himself and his peers. His experience was rooted in that patronage system, which just adds so much gravity to his later moral critiques.
Our sources also suggest his origins were provincial, which, for a Roman of his stature, is pretty unusual.
It is unusual. There are conjectures pointing to Gallia Belgica, Gallia Narbonensis, or even northern Italy. But the consensus really leans toward a provincial, non-Roman origin.
And the evidence for that is circumstantial, but it's pretty convincing.
It is. First, you have his marriage to Julia Agricola, the daughter of the famous general Gnaeus Julius Agricola.
Okay.
Agricola's family was deeply entrenched in Gallia Narbonensis, that's modern southern France, so that marriage ties him directly to the successful provincial aristocracy.
And then there's that famous anecdote involving Pliny the Younger.
Yes, this is so telling. In Pliny's letters, he recounts being asked by a peer whether he was Italian or provincial. Pliny gives a sort of vague, witty answer.
And the guy pushes him on it.
The peer presses further, asking, "Are you Tacitus or Pliny?" And since Pliny was definitively an Italian from Como, the implied distinction suggests Tacitus was the one known, or at least assumed, to be provincial. It was a slight difference in pedigree, but one the elite absolutely noticed.
That subtle class distinction, even among the most successful people, is so revealing about Roman society.
It is.
And this leads to the intriguing Celt theory.
It does. And the theory is fascinating because it connects his perceived origins with his unique talents. Some scholars suggest he might have been a Celt from Gaul.
Why? What's the thinking there?
Well, because the Celts, particularly those in Gaul, had this reputation in the ancient world for exceptional skill in oratory. And Tacitus's renowned courtroom skill fits that stereotype perfectly.
And there's a second piece to that theory.
There is. It's his sympathetic view of those who are resisting Rome.
Right.
The way he frames the resistance of the native Britons in the Agricola or the Germanic tribes in the Germania, he depicts them as having this liberty and moral purity that Rome had lost. It suggests an innate understanding or sympathy for the subjugated perspective.
Which might stem from his own non-Roman Italian or Gallic background.
It's a very compelling idea.
Well, whether he was a Celt or Italian, he clearly wasn't sitting on the sidelines. Let's get into the cursus honorum, that ladder of Roman political advancement.
He had to climb it. Public life required it. He studied rhetoric and law in Rome, possibly under the great orator Quintilian, to prepare for his ascent.
So he gets the Letus Clavus, the purple stripe under Vespasian.
That's his entry into senatorial order. And then his first major step was becoming quaestor under Titus around 81 or 82 AD.
And what did that signal, getting that position so early?
The quaestorship was the gateway to the Senate, achieving it at the earliest possible age, likely 25, under the direct patronage of the ruling Flavian dynasty, showed he was highly favored. He was politically aligned.
He wasn't just qualified, he was trusted.
He was trusted. And then the ascent just became rapid. I mean, he really sprinted up that ladder, as the sources suggest.
Praetor in 88 AD.
Yes. He reached the praetorship in 88 AD. This was an important year. The praetors served judicial roles, and Tacitus was required to assist with the elaborate secular games held by Emperor Domitian.
So he's now a very public figure.
A very public figure. And at the same time, he joins the Quindecimvir Sacris Faciundis, one of the 4 major priestly colleges. Holding both of those positions was a clear indicator that he was now part of the established political and religious elite.
And then he reaches the absolute pinnacle of his senatorial career, but only after the fall of Domitian.
Yes, the capstone was the suffect consulship in 97 AD under the new, brief Emperor Nerva. This was crucial.
Consul was the highest you could go.
The highest-ranking civil position. And for someone from an equestrian provincial background, this was a massive achievement. The first time anyone in his known family line had achieved this honor, it signaled his political rehabilitation in the post-tyranny era.
And his career didn't stop there. He kept working, even while writing his histories.
Absolutely. The sources confirm he held the highest civilian governorship later in life, serving as the proconsul of Asia, a major and highly prestigious province in western Anatolia from 112 to 113 AD.
And we have physical proof of that.
We do. There's an inscription found at Mylasa that confirms this specific appointment. So what this means is that Tacitus lived and worked at the highest levels of Roman administration right up to the end of his life.
Which gave him continuous first-hand access to the inner workings of imperial power that fueled his historical analysis.
Exactly.
But the real engine of his writing, the psychological crucible that shaped his entire perspective, was surviving the reign of Domitian between 81 and 96 AD.
That reign of terror was the defining moral and political event of his life. The sources are unequivocal. Surviving Domitian left Tacitus, quote, jaded and perhaps ashamed in his own complicity.
He lived through a period where loyalty was enforced by summary execution.
And where the Senate was reduced to a rubber stamp, often applauding the deaths of their own peers just to save their own lives.
That deep personal sense of shame and his powerful hatred of tyranny, that's what drove him to write the Annals and Histories.
It had to be. The history couldn't just be a simple chronicle of emperors. It had to be a moral reckoning of the class that allowed tyranny to flourish in the first place.
He had to dissect the moral failures of the Senate, of his own class.
And he articulated the horror of Domitian's rule not through lists of executions, but through the psychological impact on the survivors.
Which brings us to that quote from the Agricola. It is maybe the best illustration of that specific flavor of tyranny.
It is the most chilling line about the nature of survival under a despot. He described the continuous, calculated atrocities under Domitian, emphasizing the forced observation and participation of the citizenry.
And the quote is just, it's brutal.
Listen to how he frames the unique cruelty of that era. Even Nero turned his eyes away and did not gaze upon the atrocities which he ordered. With Domitian, it was the chief part of our miseries to see and to be seen, to know that our sighs were being recorded.
To see and to be seen. Wow. So the tyranny wasn't just physical, it was performative.
It was performative. The despot forces you to be complicit just by witnessing, and the state records your reaction. Even a sigh of disapproval becomes a crime.
It turns political life into a terrifying form of psychological theater.
It does. Tacitus recognized that the true horror of Domitian wasn't just the murders, but the mandated moral collapse of the entire governing structure. He broke their spirit by demanding public silence and inward consent.
He's asking, how do you maintain your virtue when even mourning the dead is recorded as a crime against the state?
That experience informs his entire approach to history. He felt the Senate had squandered their cultural inheritance of free speech, traded it for the temporary security of survival.
So his writing becomes a kind of delayed act of defiance.
An attempt to use the written word to say what could not be said aloud during the tyranny.
That personal trauma, then, directly motivated the creation of his two great historical works, the Annals and the Histories.
That single, seamless narrative, he planned to cover the period from 14 AD to 96 AD.
What's extraordinary, and a point we really need to emphasize, is just how precarious their survival was. The fact that these works exist at all is a historical miracle.
It truly is. I mean, the survival story is a classic case of historical happenstance. Think about this. The entire first half of the Annals, the crucial material on Tiberius, survived because of one single manuscript.
One copy.
A single manuscript copy preserved in the remote Corvey Abbey in Germany.
And the second half?
The second half, covering Claudius and Nero, also survived in a single manuscript, this one from Monte Cassino in Italy.
So if either of those manuscripts had been lost to a fire or a war or just neglect,
our perspective on the Julio-Claudian dynasty would be dramatically diminished. We'd be forced to rely on less skeptical, less critical sources. It's remarkable that they survived at all.
It makes you wonder how many other histories, maybe with conflicting viewpoints, are just gone forever.
It does.
And Tacitus actually tackled the history backward, right? He started with the histories and the events he personally witnessed.
Yes, the Histories were the first work he published, probably around the end of the first century. They were intended to cover the period from the civil wars of the year of the four emperors in 69 AD up to the death of Domitian in 96. This was his contemporary history.
The events he was closest to.
Exactly.
But what we have left of it is tragically little.
So little. We only possess the first 4 books and 26 chapters of the 5th. So the text just breaks off early in 70 AD. We lose the entire narrative of the Flavian dynasty.
But even that fragment is invaluable for certain specific insights.
Yeah, for sure.
I want to focus on Book 5, which has that fascinating digression on the ancient Jews. Why would Tacitus include an ethnographic survey in the middle of a war narrative?
It was actually standard classical practice. To introduce an enemy, especially in a major military conflict, you'd give an analysis of their customs and history. So Tacitus includes this short but absolutely crucial survey as a prelude to describing Titus's suppression of the First Jewish-Roman War.
And what does that survey tell us about the Roman mindset?
It reveals a deep cultural misunderstanding and, frankly, the biases of the Roman elite. Tacitus reports Roman views that portray Jewish customs as bizarre, hostile, contrary to Roman pietists.
He struggled with their theology.
He really did. He couldn't understand the concept of monotheism, the rejection of visible human-like gods. He interpreted it as superstition or even godlessness. But it's an indispensable record because it shows us exactly how Roman officials viewed the population they were trying to control.
So even in a fragment, we get this invaluable historical snapshot of cultural conflict.
Right.
And after completing the Histories, he turns his attention to the earlier period, writing the Annals.
The Annals were his final work. Starting where the empire really began, with the death of Augustus in 14 AD, he completed at least 16 books tracing the reigns of Tiberius, Claudius, and Nero.
But as we said, we're missing huge chunks. Books 7 through 10 are just gone.
Gone entirely, and fragments of others. The surviving work breaks off abruptly in 66 AD.
It leaves a huge gap. But the sections we do have are cited globally, often for reasons outside of Roman political history. I'm talking about the crucial extra-biblical references to the early Christian movement.
This is one of the immense historical weights carried by the Annals. They provide two pieces of evidence that are just essential. First, we have an early secular account of the persecution of Christians under Emperor Nero.
After the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD.
Exactly. Tacitus describes how Nero deflected public hatred onto this marginalized group, referring to them as practitioners of a deadly superstition.
And secondly, more importantly, the earliest non-Christian reference we have to the actual execution of the founder of the movement.
Yes. In Annals 15.44. In the context of Nero blaming the Christians for the fire, Tacitus mentions the founder, referring to Christus, who had been executed in the reign of Tiberius by the procurator Pontius Pilate.
It's brief, but the historical weight of that sentence is just. It cannot be overstated.
No, it's corroborating evidence from a high-ranking Roman state official and historian that the event was a documented secular fact.
It's astonishing that a few lines penned by a cynical Roman politician provide such critical external evidence for two major global forces.
The Jewish-Roman conflicts and the early persecution of Christians.
He was recording details that he probably barely considered important at the time, but which became monumental for future history.
His focus was on the Senate and the emperors. But his scrupulous use of state records meant he preserved these crucial details about the edges of the empire and the new social movements bubbling up beneath the surface.
So beyond those monumental historical works, Tacitus also wrote 3 shorter pieces, the monographs.
Right. These were kind of focused, thematic deep dives. They seem to have served as warm-ups, or maybe vehicles for more immediate political commentary.
They allowed him to test his style and deliver these powerful critiques without the huge scope of the Annals.
Exactly. Let's start with the Agricola. It was published early in the post-Domitianic era, around 98 AD.
And this is the biography of his father-in-law, Gnaeus Julius Agricola, the general who spearheaded the Roman conquest of Britain.
Right. And while on the surface it's a family tribute, the Agricola is actually a really sophisticated political manifesto.
So it's not just a biography.
Not at all. It details the geography and ethnography of ancient Britain, but the true brilliance is in the contrast Tacitus draws. Agricola's disciplined, virtuous public service is used as a direct foil to the paranoia and moral decadence of Emperor Domitian back in Rome.
So he's using the life of an honorable man who survived tyranny to critique the tyranny itself. It's a subtle act of political protest.
It is. The work favorably contrasts the pure liberty of the native Britons who choose fierce resistance with the abject moral corruption he saw in the Roman aristocracy. It's asking the reader, where's true honor found?
In the quiet compliance of a good man like Agricola, or in the futile resistance of the barbarians.
Exactly.
And this section brings us to maybe the most famous and devastating piece of rhetoric in all of ancient literature, the quote he attributes to the British leader Agricola.
This quote is a complete rejection of the moral claims of the Roman Empire. It's a masterstroke. Tacitus, ever the savvy survivor, puts this searing indictment in the mouth of an enemy commander.
Which allows him to state the ugly truth about Roman policy without officially endorsing it himself.
Precisely. Let's dedicate a moment to that quote. Agricola is addressing his troops before a decisive battle, and he asserts the true, cynical nature of Roman expansion.
The line in Latin is famously concise.
It is. Offer trucidar opere falsis nominibus imperium, atque ubi solitudinem feciunt, pacem appellant.
To ravage, to slaughter, to usurp under false titles, they call empire. And where they make a desert, they call it peace.
I mean,
That is just the ultimate condensation of cynicism. What specific Roman policies was he indicting through Calgacus?
he was indicting the policy of conquest for profit, the endless need for war to justify imperial ambition, and the sheer hypocrisy of presenting violent subjugation as civilization.
So when Rome claimed to bring the Pax Romana, the Roman peace,
Tacitus forces you to acknowledge that that peace was often achieved only after mass slaughter and destruction, leaving the conquered land empty. A desert. It suggests Roman civilization was just highly organized criminality.
and by putting this truth in the mouth of a barbarian, he weaponizes the outsider's perspective to shame the insider.
It allows the reader to hear the truth the Senate was too afraid to speak.
Okay, moving on. The second monograph is the Germania, also published around 98 AD.
This one is a pure ethnographic work. It follows in the classical tradition of figures like Herodotus or Julius Caesar, detailing the lands, laws, and customs of the Germanic tribes living outside the empire's borders.
How is it structured? What makes it historically unique?
It's structured logically.
Yeah.
First part details their general customs, their physique, military, government, religion. Then the second part details specific tribes, moving geographically from the Rhine frontier all the way to the Baltic Sea.
And it's unique because it's often the only information we have about these cultures.
For sure. The only surviving information before they become major players in the later Roman world.
And again, this work carries a subtle but persistent political critique of Rome, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Tacitus consistently highlights the simple, uncorrupted virtues of the Germanic tribes. Their marital fidelity, their rigorous martial spirit, their lack of luxury,
So he describes their strict marriage laws.
where infidelity was punished severely. And this was a clear, implicit criticism aimed directly at the loose morals, the endemic corruption, and the luxurious excesses of the Roman ruling class he saw every day.
He was essentially telling his Roman readers, look at the barbarians, they live better than we do.
Pretty much a stark warning.
Finally, we have the Dialogus de Oratoribus, the dialogue on oratory. This one feels like an outlier, both in form and in style.
It certainly is.
Yeah.
It's likely one of his earliest works. And its style is the key difference. It consciously imitates the smooth, flowing, complex rhetorical style of the great Republican orator Cicero.
Which is a stark contrast to the dense, condensed, and, well, harsh prose of his later histories.
Completely different.
So it represents his earlier, maybe less cynical view of the world before Domitian hardened him.
That's the consensus. The dialogue format discusses the art of rhetoric itself, reflecting his own education and early career. But the core theme connects deeply to his later historical concerns. It explores why high-quality, powerful public oratory declined so severely under the empire.
And what's the conclusion?
The conclusion is political. True, powerful oratory dies when true political freedom dies. The art of debate flourished in the Republic because there were real consequences to speaking out.
Your words mattered.
They mattered. Laws were decided by debate. But under the empire, where all final power rested with the emperor, speaking out became useless and often fatal.
So the dialogue marks the moment Tacitus realized his primary skill, oratory, was essentially moot.
And that compelled him to shift his focus from speaking to writing history.
Which brings us to the core of his genius. His literary style, the Tacitine prose, and his penetrating psychological insights into power.
Yes.
His prose is legendary, dense, concise, epigrammatic. It feels less like history and more like political philosophy delivered through narrative.
And it's challenging precisely because he intentionally moved away from the literary standards of his predecessors.
His Latin is not flowing or beautiful in the Ciceronian sense.
No long, balanced sentences. None. He uses short, punchy sentences, linguistic discord, and a deliberate lack of smoothing transitions.
What's the effect of that? Of consciously breaking the conventions?
The effect is immediate and jarring. Some readers, both then and now, find it harsh, unpleasant, and thorny. It forces you to work harder. But others find it stimulating and intriguing because it focuses solely on the meaning.
It cuts out the rhetorical fluff.
Exactly. He never glosses the facts. He sticks to a chronological narrative, but one so condensed that you, the reader, must synthesize the moral judgment for yourself.
He packs an entire political analysis into a single sentence. Let's look again at the opening of the Annals, that quote about the difficulty of writing history under the Julia Claudians.
This passage is a mission statement and a warning. Regarding the histories of Tiberius, Gaius, Claudius, and Nero, he writes, the histories of Tiberius, Gaius, Claudius, and Nero, while they were in power, were falsified through terror, and after their death were written under the irritation of a recent hatred.
That is 4 diagnoses in one breath. The 2 major failures of history writing: terror while the emperor is alive, and vindictive bias after he dies. It's just perfect political and literary criticism.
And he achieves that conciseness by deliberately violating the grammatical expectations of his audience. He uses varied synonyms and forces parallel structures into discord. He's signaling, through his very syntax, that the world he's describing is broken, unnatural, and harsh.
The style mirrors the era it describes.
Perfectly.
Shifting to his historiographical claim, we have to address his famous declaration in Annals 1, Ela Scenara et Studio.
Without either anger or zeal.
He promises to relate events without either anger or zeal, motives from which I am far removed.
And this declaration is the source of endless scholarly debate because, as you noted, his works are clearly brimming with moral indignation. There is a palpable rage against corruption.
So how do we reconcile that, this claim of neutrality, with the deep pessimistic moral judgment that pervades every page? Was he being disingenuous?
Or was he defining a new form of objectivity? Scholars argue he was defining historical objectivity in a new way. For Tacitus, sine era et studio wasn't a claim to be without opinion that was impossible for a moral Roman.
So what was it then?
It was a commitment to being free from the personal biases of patronage, the studium, or vengeful personal grudges, the ira. He adopted the cold, concise facade of objective reporting precisely to lend maximum weight to his moralistic observations on power.
So the facts, concisely and accurately presented, are allowed to deliver the damning verdict, not the author's own inflamed language.
That's the theory. And that objective facade allows him to offer these profoundly pessimistic insights into the psychology of power. He wasn't just tracking dates, he was tracking the moral decline of individuals.
Blending straight descriptions with moral lessons and high drama.
He was preoccupied with the power dynamics between the remaining republican institutions, like the Senate, and the emperors. His analysis continually circled back to the corruption that ensued as the Senate voluntarily surrendered its cultural inheritance, its right to free speech, just to placate the ruler.
And he made one absolutely crucial predictive observation about the ultimate source of imperial authority after the Civil War following Nero's death.
Yes, this is maybe his single most important strategic insight about the structural weakness of the entire empire. After the chaos of 69 AD, the year of the 4 emperors, he observed, now had been divulged that secret of the empire, that emperors could be made elsewhere than at Rome.
The secret of the empire. Let's analyze the weight of that statement. It means power no longer resided in the Senate, the ancient city, or republican tradition.
It was a brutal revelation. It meant the power was entirely dependent on the legions in the provinces. When those legions discovered they could raise and depose emperors at will, as happened when Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian all seized power through military backing, the geographic center of power shifted.
The Senate, the aristocracy, the people of Rome, they were just spectators now.
Just spectators, dependent on which armies decided to march on the capital. This insight explains the bitterness and cynicism underlying all of his later political analysis. The emperor wasn't the master of Rome. He was the hostage of his armies.
This kind of cynical realism, born from surviving Domitian, explains why he refuses to paint his characters in simple black and white. His greatest triumph is the nuanced character portrait.
Tacitus refrains from conclusively taking sides. He will often praise and criticize the same person, sometimes within the same chapter. He's dedicated to tracing psychological complexity, not delivering easy moral summaries.
And the perfect example of that is his treatment of Emperor Tiberius in the Annals.
Oh, Tiberius's portrait is a masterpiece of gradual decline. He appears predominantly positive in the first books of the Annals. He shows political competence, discretion, a careful adherence to constitutional forms.
But this carefully constructed image begins to crumble.
Dramatically. After the rise and intrigue of the notorious Praetorian prefect Sejanus, Tacitus traces Tiberius's descent into paranoia, suspicion, and cruelty once he retreats to Capri.
He doesn't just simplify Tiberius as evil, he traces the psychological corruption. He shows how an initially competent leader loses himself to fear and distrust.
And this ambiguity is so deep that it has fractured scholarly interpretation into 2 distinct schools of thought. We have the Black Tacitists,
Okay.
who view him as fundamentally rejecting the imperial system. seeing the Annals as proof that all power corrupts absolutely.
And then the Red Tacitus.
The Red Tacitus argue the opposite. They see him as a realist who supports the necessary structure of the empire for stability, despite its flaws.
So they would say Tiberius's early decisions show necessary political realism, not just manipulation.
Exactly. And the fact that Tacitus supports both readings is the ultimate testament to his literary depth and complexity.
And he was just relentless in exposing the gap between the public face and the private moral reality.
He excels at exposing hypocrisy and dissimulation, often using precise factual contrast. For instance, he might note Tiberius's public distribution of funds for fire relief, a necessary gesture of imperial benevolence.
And then immediately follow that up by recalling Tiberius's failure to curb the abuses of justice, which he himself had initiated.
Right. He's showing you that public generosity often serves as a smokescreen for private, systemic moral failure.
So how did this deeply moralistic and, let's be honest, profoundly biased historian maintain the veneer of objectivity needed to launch such a devastating critique? What sources did he rely on?
He was, in terms of methodology, scrupulous. He used official state records, which were extremely comprehensive. This included the Acta Senatus, the actual minutes of the Senate sessions.
So he had an internal view of political debate.
He did. And the Acta Diurna, which were the official government acts and news of the capital, almost like an early daily gazette. He also used collections of emperor's speeches and official letters.
And he cross-referenced contemporary historians, right?
Yes. He was diligent about comparing accounts, citing the works of contemporaries like Pliny the Elder, Fabius Rusticus, and Cluvius Rufus.
Yeah.
He used these diverse sources to construct his complex narratives.
But he also used a darker, more philosophical source, the Exodus Illustrium Virorum.
The deaths of famous men.
Hmm.
These were the martyrdom accounts you mentioned earlier.
Right.
They were collections documenting the final moments and speeches of those who died opposing the emperors, often men who chose philosophical suicide rather than submitting to tyranny. These functioned as powerful, almost mythological narratives for those who opposed the Principate.
Positioning these men as martyrs for lost republican liberty.
Yes.
What was Tacitus's relationship with these martyrdom narratives? He used them, but with a bit of ambivalence.
He was deeply conflicted. He utilized them, and he often gave prominence and eloquence to the final speeches of the condemned, like Cremutius Cordus's powerful parting words.
But he personally viewed many of these Stoic suicides as politically useless and ostentatious.
Useless.
Why useless?
Because they achieved nothing politically. They just gave the tyrant an excuse to seize their property and repress their followers. Tacitus preferred the quiet, pragmatic survival exemplified by his father-in-law, Agricola.
A man who maintained his honor while remaining active in service rather than making a grand, futile gesture.
He was skeptical of motive, even in martyrdom. He wasn't just interested in the action, but in the political utility and the moral intention behind it. That psychological focus is the enduring genius of Tacitus.
Looking back across his life and works, Tacitus's legacy is crystal clear. He is the historian who captured the moral decay and corruption of Rome's governing class with an unparalleled intensity.
He gave us these unique windows into the earliest secular records of Christianity, the Jewish-Roman conflicts, and the collapse of Republican ethics.
And his prose concise, powerful, and deeply psychological. It remains a defining hallmark of critical historical writing.
He essentially codified the dynamics of authoritarianism, the necessary complicity of the elite, the futility of resistance, and the total dependence of the emperor on military might.
He showed us how institutions die not in a sudden cataclysm,
but with the quiet, gradual sacrifice of individual integrity.
And this brings us back to that central contradiction we analyzed. Tacitus, the survivor and politician, claimed to write Cinela et Studio without anger or zeal.
Right.
Yet his pages are filled with rage against corruption, and he is celebrated precisely for his penetrating moral and psychological judgments.
And this raises a powerful final question for you, the listener, to carry forward. Did Tacitus's true genius lie not in achieving perfect neutrality, which, for a witness of Domitian's terror, was likely impossible, but in weaponizing his objectivity? By adopting that cold, concise, neutral reporting style, he created a far more devastating and enduring critique of power than any purely emotional or rhetorical attack ever could have.
So in the study of history and politics, is true historical impartiality always, at its most effective, simply a highly refined mask for profound moral judgment?
Think about that tension between objectivity and outrage the next time you try to diagnose the nature of power.
A truly fantastic thought to leave us with. Thank you for taking this deep dive into the silent voice of Roman history. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.